In a genre of fiction that I like, which is, well, it's two, the fantasy world, and you could say I live there all the time. That wouldn't be entirely true. And the science fiction world. There, if you go to online descriptions of various books, in the comments section, after they give them stars, when they're starting to describe the books, they often talk in those genres about the quality of world building. How convincing is the world that the author is describing? This is just a comment. It doesn't mean a lot. It means whether you might like the book, but it doesn't have a whole lot to do with my daily life. But tonight, in this gospel, we have two kinds of world building that are being described, and they're both of enormous consequence. There's the world building that Augustus, the Caesar, is attempting to undertake, and it's under the guise of a census. Now, despite the previous administration of the United States, a census is a good thing in our world. But it's a different census that we're talking about with the Roman Empire. Much, much earlier, under the kings of Israel, another census was taken, and God condemned the king for making the census, because the census was a tool for building a world, for creating the way a king, or in this case, an emperor, wants the world to be. The world is to be shaped according to the vision of an empire. That empire, the Roman Empire, came and went. It was a long empire, as empires go, but others have risen and taken its place, and they too have fallen. But in each case, it's important for the empire to do some serious world building in order that people will fall in line. The census imposed difficulties, hardships on the people to fulfill the order of the census. Each person was to go to the home, the ancestral home, to be registered there. If you're a person who doesn't have a lot and there's no public transportation, there's no fossil fuel industry to get you there, this is a heavy thing. So this world building comes on the shoulders of ordinary people, and it is to enforce a view of life that has recognizable features that you and I recognize. There are some people who impose on others, and there are people who are imposed upon. It is not a world where everyone is a subject, where everyone has standing, where there's dignity for each person. So that's the world building that the emperor is about. There's another world building that's going on at the very same time. And both services today, the 7:30 Eucharist that we had earlier this evening and the one tonight, Dean Malcolm prayed over there. Could you all see what was going on over there? Well, there's something over behind a glass front in that transept, the north transept. It's a creche. It's a depiction carved in wood in Valencia, Spain, in 1956. And it is the world that Jesus was building. That world is the world that is in opposition to the world Augustus was building. So what does that world look like over there? You know that the first Christmas pageant, we had the pageant earlier today. If you'll just turn your heads and look behind that way, you see a statue with red balls around its neck on my right. That's St. Francis, the patron saint of San Francisco, the patron saint of this cathedral, and it was Francis who started the first Christmas pageant. Biblical scholars do not love Christmas pageants. They are not favored because they mash things up. The Magi don't appear in the gospel we heard tonight. That's Luke's gospel. They belong in Matthew's gospel. They're months later. This is a mess. Francis was telling a different kind of truth. He was describing the world building that Jesus was after, a different kind of reality, where all those figures are there at the same time because they're all part of the world that he was summoning into being. Who's there? Well, we don't see the angels. There's verisimilitude here. They've already announced their message to the shepherds. The shepherds are there with their sheep. They didn't leave them, apparently. They brought them. There's ox. There's a donkey. The star is above the creche. The celestial beings are there. The shepherds are there. The Magi have gathered. Iranian Zoroastrians, perhaps. They're all there. And they, together with the Holy Family, constitute the world that Jesus is building. What does that world look like? Well, it really is going to be fulfilled when this baby who's in a manger grows up and starts summoning the world into being that he envisioned. And we could call it God's dream that he was bringing into being. And all that Jesus was bringing into being as an adult is there in the world that gathered around the infant Jesus. If you've picked up a California oak acorn and looked at it, and seen when you look at the acorn, the oak that might grow from it, that's what you're looking at with the infant Jesus and the community that has gathered around him, the world that has started to be summoned. It will be in fullness when Jesus grows up. And he goes around and he does several things. He starts to call the unqualified. I think that's the term that our Dean Emeritus used to use. If you feel unqualified and you're here at Grace Cathedral, you're in the right place. The unqualified, the dispossessed, these are the people that Jesus brought to his table. When I came to the Diocese of California, when Sheila and I moved here in 2006, the Episcopal Church was just about to go through some seismic changes in terms of human sexuality, in terms of women's ordination, in many, many ways. And one of those ways was on a Sunday morning in an Episcopal church, before 2006, a priest would stand up at the time of the communion, and typically they would say this: if you're a baptized Christian, you are welcome at the holy table of Jesus Christ. You can come. And we thought that we were doing a good thing at that time. Ground zero for what is called the open table movement was here in California, in the Diocese of California, with a woman named Sarah Miles, who goes to St. Gregory's Church on Potrero Hill. And Sarah wrote a book, and it was called Take This Bread. And she wrote about how she was converted to Christianity by being invited to the table of Jesus before she was baptized. Wow. That may not seem like much to you, but that was a big deal for us. And I wasn't sure, as the bishop of this diocese, just coming here from the East Coast, how I should receive this idea. And one of the priests of this diocese sat down with me and said, the way I read the story of Jesus is this: he always was taking away barriers for people to sit down at the table with him instead of putting them up. Wouldn't you like to be like him? What do you say to that? Sure. So really, that is what he was doing. Dean Malcolm spoke about these people at the last service. They were outside. They were prostitutes. They were tax collectors, meaning they worked for the Roman Empire. They were wealthy people who got wealthy off of poor people. They were the poor themselves. And when we say the poor, we don't mean 60% of 80,000 a year. We mean people who are in San Francisco, the unhoused. This is Jesus' community. And he invited them all to dinner with him on a daily basis. In fact, he said that this is what they called him. They said that John the Baptist, who came before him, had a demon because John was kind of ascetic, and they called him, he said, a drunkard and a glutton because he enjoyed bringing people together. So the dispossessed are the people represented by the shepherds. The magi are people from other religions who are welcomed into the beloved community. There is no Christianity at this point. Jesus is not converting them to worship him. He's inviting them into a radical new community where all are welcome. And as our presiding bishop says, it's not the family of God, the human family, it's the family of all life. So that's why the sheep are there. That's why the ox is there. That's why the donkey is there. Who knows who else? All there. This is the world building that Jesus is about. I made a difficult announcement at the beginning of this service, difficult for me. It's hard to face these changes. It's hard to face the continuing isolation. It's hard to think about upwards of 1 million people in this country alone dying from COVID. Sometimes the world building in these two different directions doesn't seem equal, does it? It seems like the world building that we can call the shadowy side, the emperor's side, has the upper hand. I have thought this. I have believed this. And there are many people today who believe this. They've lost hope. I would understand that. When I was a young priest, I would preach that. I would say something like this. There were terrible things going on during the Roman Empire. There are terrible things going on today. And it was kind of like an equivalency between the two. And there was an elderly woman in the congregation that I served, and she wrote me a letter every time I preached a sermon. May I say, this is a rare thing. And she wasn't complimenting me, nor was she criticizing me consistently. She was writing what she saw, what she heard, what she thought about it. And she said in that regard that I was very wrong. She said, it is only from your very limited human perspective. People are always telling me how limited my perspective is, and I accept that. It is only from your limited human perspective that this seems like an equal struggle in world building between the empire and Jesus. They are not equal. Now, she said that she was a student of a Jesuit priest who was also a paleontologist whose name was Teilhard de Chardin. And de Chardin said that the world is moving towards what he called the omega point. And the omega point is when all things are made well, when things are healed and integrated and made whole. And he said that this is truth. whether I can see it or not. But my friends, there are some people who see this, who see better than others. And one of those is the person who wrote the Gospel of John. Now, tomorrow morning, if you come back on Christmas Day to Grace Cathedral, you'll hear that Gospel, the prologue of John, read as the Gospel. And Father Jude Harmon will be preaching on that Gospel. And in that Gospel, it says this: what was coming into the world in Jesus was life. And that life shows up as light. And there is shadow. But the shadow neither understands the light, nor can it overcome the light. And that this is true. And I think that John is one of those seers who sees truth better than I do, better than many people do. He sees truth as God sees it. There's armies that support the emperor's world building. And they're brutal, and they can take lives, and they do take lives, and that is a reality. But the angels who appeared to the shepherds, to the unqualified, the dispossessed, the dirty and ruffian shepherds who represent you and me, those angels were named as soldiers. They are the army of God. So here's why the light is going to overcome and become the omega point. Because the army that is being enlisted, the world building that Jesus is about, involves you. And the more unqualified you feel, the more you're enlisted. But it does take something, my friends. It takes living as Jesus lived. It takes becoming compassionate as he was compassionate. It means being brave enough to include somebody that you'd rather not include at your table. This, again, let me return to Francis, was a defining moment in his life. A wealthy young man, highly privileged in his part of Italy, deeply afraid of lepers. Deeply afraid of lepers. So think about it. What is it for me? What is it for you that is the boundary? The person you'd rather not invite to your table. Not the generic person. Maybe think about the actual person that it's just hard to think about having at the table. Our country has divided in definitive ways, and there are people, families, that say we can no longer speak to each other. It's impossible. The world building that Jesus is envisioning is a world building where I would have felt enough love from Jesus, who included me, so that I would have the strength to include that person at my table. Ruby Sales, the wonderful civil rights activist whose life was saved by Jonathan Daniels, was the guest of this diocese this past fall. And she talked about this. She talked about being a black woman, 17-year-old, registering voters in Alabama, being arrested, being the focus of an assassination attempt in which Jonathan gave his life to save her. And she ended her first workshop by saying, we need to have the courage to love. And one of my deacons of this diocese called me the next day and said, I left that workshop and I called my cousin, who'd been my best friend all my life until Donald Trump was elected, and I couldn't talk to him anymore. and we reconciled. Now, he didn't change his political opinions. He didn't change his mind. He changed his heart. This is what Jesus' world building looks like. And you have the power to do this. You've been given the power to do this by the love of Christ. And this is why the light is increasing and moving us towards the omega point, where Christmas is kept every day by all of us.